It's the UConn Popcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And Jeff, today we're discussing a book. We haven't discussed a book in the past.
This is our first time delving into this medium, and we're going to discuss Prophet's Song by Paul Lynch.
Yeah, so books, for or against?
For.
You're in favour of books. Okay, me too. I like them as well.
Yeah.
And not the first one I've read, just the first one we've discussed on the channel. Prophet's Song, a work of literary fiction. The winner of the 2023 Booker Prize, which is kind of the main British literary prize. Mm-hmm. It's a dystopian novel, is that fair to say?
Amongst other things.
Yeah. Yes. And in this dystopian novel, a fascist, totalitarian is maybe the safer word.
Yes.
Government comes to power quite suddenly and with very little context in the Republic of Ireland.
Right.
And so Prophet's Song is then the story, not really of only partially of the trajectory of that regime, but much more about the highly localized effects of that regime's kind of actions and operations on the Stack family.
Yes.
Eilish Stack, who's the sort of central character, Larry Stack, who disappears quite, literally actually he's disappeared quite early on. And what do they have, 4 children?
4 children, 1 baby.
Yeah, a baby, a daughter who's
14 or 15.
Yeah, a middle son who's sort of 15, 16.
The oldest son is 16.
Okay.
At the beginning of the narrative.
So barely the middle son has got to be.
Middle son's
14,
11
13?
or 12.
Okay, so slightly younger than I thought.
Yes.
Okay, all right, and it's their story of how they attempt to survive within that context.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about. I think maybe we should go actually straight to our first section, which is the kind of on the surface section. We do have 3 sections when we discuss works of popular culture. Section 1, which we call On the Surface, where we address matters of plot and textuality and maybe textual technique, regardless of what the medium is, and maybe intertextual allusions. Section 2, which we call Mythologies, where we address the meaning structures that audiences, I nearly said the audience, but of course audiences plural, might bring to the text and that are necessary to kind of comprehend different parts of the text. And then section 3, which we call critique, in which we either find or attempt to provide a sort of against the grain understanding of what's going on, or locate something in the text that is troubling or problematizing some elements of quote unquote reality.
Right. And the other thing that we do in this final layer of analysis of critique is that we do a bit of a deep dive into what critical and other learned commentators on the work have done and what they make of it. And given the prestige nature of this book, we're not going to be at a loss for these kinds of criticisms or interpretations of Prophet's Song.
No, it's a highly acclaimed book amongst the prestige community and won the Booker Prize. Maybe we should actually, before we do plot, do a bit of a temperature check.
Yeah.
You hate this.
I didn't like it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't hate it, but I'm not sure to what extent I'm appreciative of it. That's kind of an open question. I will say this about it, that I've continued to, I kind of finished it about a month ago, and I've continued to think about it, and not only because we were going to talk about it, because bits of it continued to come back to me. Some scenes really stuck with me.
Yes.
So anyway,
it's definitely memorable, and so I don't have any. It's not that I find it unmemorable. It's, as we'll talk about, I had a lot of problems with the overall structure of the narrative, the way that it's embedded, and I was left wanting to understand to whom the intended audience was and what the intended message was.
Okay. All right. So let's get into section 1, which is our section on the surface. I guess the first thing we should talk about is plot. We've already said a little bit. This is the coming to power very suddenly in the work of in the wake of a teachers' strike. A totalitarian government. Maybe that's just
even that I think is unclear. And this is one of the issues. And I guess we may as well, just since we're talking about plot, and a part of the on the surface element of the level of analysis is the question of the author's intention, right? And what does the author intend the audience to understand? And here, I would say by and large that this is a deeply underdeveloped and undercontextualized story. It fixates so much on the Stack family that it essentially ignores or doesn't provide us with any kind of specific context. In fact, although the novel is set in Dublin, I'm pretty sure that the only people who would understand any of these references are Dubliners.
Okay.
Did you understand any of the street references or the old?
I didn't. So I haven't spent a lot of time in Dublin, but I've been there often enough. I mean, like actually largely because it's a connecting flight destination, so I'll often meet my family there. I've been there often enough that I have a sense of Dublin that I found useful in, and maybe that's why I like the book a little bit more. I could actually imagine walking some of these streets. Yeah. No, I didn't recognize any of the individual streets. Right. But I had enough of a kind of a sense of the atmosphere of the place to get it.
Which I found, I mean, on one hand, and maybe we should just talk about this now. On one hand, one can understand Lynch's intention at decontextualizing the story and the elements of the story that would give it a truly embedded sense of place. One can understand that because part of what's going on here, maybe the entirety of the author's intention, is to present a general story of it can happen here, right? The descent into totalitarianism can happen in even places that appear to be stable, right? And so the goal is a universal goal, and to not embed it too specifically within any one locale or too specifically within, for example, any one sense of political ideology or motivation. But it also means that when it comes to trying to understand, for the reader to try to understand what has led or precipitated these events, the reader's left with almost nothing. And so you had mentioned that it appears to be a totalitarian crackdown in consequence or in response to a teacher's strike, but I don't know that we actually get that there's a teacher's strike. We get that there's a protest, right, that the teachers union is launching. But even before that protest, it's clear that the union is in a perilous position. The teachers union is in a perilous position politically, but we don't know why.
Yeah. So I think that I agree with all that. I suppose I don't see it quite as the weakness you do. I think I don't think it's inadvertent or kind of bad storytelling or bad writing. I think he's trying to produce a sort of allegorical story. I think you're right. The right word is it's supposed to be universal. And I suppose the point of not kind of telling a political history of precisely how this happened is that it could have been the teachers' strike, but actually it was something these people wanted to do anyway, and they were just looking for some kind of excuse. It was not like, oh no, the teachers are on strike, this is a major threat to the moral core of the country. It was essentially the other side, which I characterized in the notes we exchanged before the show as kind of the comfortable liberal side, is kind of kicking up a fuss, and they're doing something that's a bit ambiguous, and we can use this as a sort of an excuse for launching the sets of political repressions that we were going to do. But it could have been something else as well. It could have been some other kind of objectionable, from their standpoint, liberal event or behavior.
Sure.
And I think that, I mean, I'm gonna hit you with a quote here from the book, Jeff, because I think it goes to your concern about the sort of parochial nature of the story, or the decontextualized nature of the story. So this is a quote from the novel. "The world is always ending over and over again in one place but not another, and the end of the world is always a local event." That I thought was quite a crucial quote. The end of the world is always a local event. "It comes to your country and visits your town and knocks on the door of your house and becomes to others but some distant warning, a brief report on the news, an echo of events that has passed into folklore."
Yes.
So I think that's crucial, that the avoidance of a detailed political narrative in the plot and specificity, and the relentless focus on the highly localized, literally household experience of the Stack family is a sort of philosophical view on what catastrophe is, and that it's not grand events and great men, great men theory of history. It's highly localized, but that doesn't make it any less apocalyptic. That is what the apocalypse is. It's not going to be a world war necessarily, or a comet, a massive planet-killing asteroid striking the Earth. It happens to people every day. It's always happening to people. Yes. It's just if they're not you don't experience it as the apocalypse.
I agree with all of that. However, the issue is that it's just not true that all places experience this kind of instability.
But it could be. This is his other great point, right? It could happen here.
But it couldn't. The only way that becomes persuasive is if you embed the story of decline in an explanation for what has happened, right?
Okay.
It is simply not true that the places that have experienced this are all the same. That isn't true. And moreover, the experience, that localized experience of the apocalyptic, is also not the same everywhere. There are reasons why certain communities and societies have experienced these kinds of calamitous declines and slips into totalitarian politics. And it's going to look different. It simply does not look the same everywhere. And while the experience may have a felt local experience, in depicting that experience as the same loss everywhere, I think Lynch has really he's lost the ability to persuade the audience that would be otherwise inclined to find this an interesting tale.
Yes. Okay. All right. So we can maybe come back to this point, because I think it's sort of at the core of differing views.
And
we might
I
have
don't want
about
to
this,
fixate too much on this, but let me put it something that we couldn't quite figure out at the beginning. You said it's a totalitarian regime, but we don't know if it's a fascist regime. Well, that's exactly the point.
Yes.
We don't know if it's a fascist regime. There seem to be elements, right? There are elements throughout the story where they refer to the party, where they refer to the importance of the state, right? That the state is a living being. There's another quote that you had pulled that comes to Eilish. It's in one of her a nightmare, really, right? In which a member of the Guard says to her, rights exist essentially at the behest of the state. They're inventions of the state.
Right.
And what the state decides is what reality is. And so that certainly sounds pretty fashy, right? But there are other elements that don't there are other elements that don't suggest that kind of commitment to the state and to overwhelming authoritarian power in principle, right? There are other elements that suggest that it's much more kind of a weird sort of Civil War, rather ordinary jockeying for power, right? And so this is part of the issue that I have with it, is that it's really difficult to understand the motivations of all of the characters, but it's especially difficult to understand the motivations of the people who are aligned with the regime, who are presented as essentially one-dimensional evil characters. And that's not especially persuasive, both because that's not actually how the vast majority of even supporters of totalitarian regimes are, but it's also problematic because it doesn't imagine the most disturbing parts of what leads one to engage in, authoritarian or fascist adjacent behavior, which is that for a lot of folks who do it, it's just an adaptation to circumstance, right? And were the circumstances different, they would behave differently.
So I didn't have that reaction. I mean, my sense was that the novel is not about politics; it's about family, and that you and I are we're political scientists. We used to wanting a lot of information about the ins and outs of the political ideologies, so we can judge is this plausible? Is this realistic? Is this most people just don't experience the behavior of the state in that way. It's how does it affect my family? And that's the point of the novel. So it would be distracting to get into a long ideological debate about which particular element of overweening state power or ideology of overweening state power is driving what's going on. The actual point is, how does it affect the family? And in particular, and I think, to kind of push the plot summary on a little bit, that the recurrent question that is posed by the events in the plot is, at what point do you know that you've tipped over from a normal political situation or even an abnormal but temporary and survivable political situation into a situation where you have to run for your life.
Yeah.
And the plot is kind of constantly posing, particularly to Eilish. I mean, Larry is kind of out of the picture relatively early on. So Eilish is left as the responsible parent trying to keep the household together. The plot is continually posing to her this question of, you know, do you know when to leave? And then at the point that you know it is time to leave, is it not already too late? And Eilish's character has been critiqued in some reviews, and I think you hold this view too, that she's a catastrophically stupid and irresponsible parent, and she behaves in sort of willfully blind ways in staying too long. I actually read her as someone slightly differently. She was acutely aware of she was not accurately aware of the risks and the dangers, but she knew that there were risks and dangers. But she was constantly weighing them against the chance that, for example, Larry would be returned.
Yeah.
And you know what would happen if she was gone, and there's always, she's always put in these situations where it's not as simple as, here's the door, do you want to walk out it? It was always a huge trade-off between catastrophic losses of leaving weighed against the hope that staying might remain a viable option.
I should say, I wouldn't say that I find her to be catastrophically stupid or dense.
I may have slightly overstated your view.
What I found to be ultimately disabling about this narrative, which is put into the words of, you know, a very minor character at the end when they're in the refugee camp, not the refugee camp, but when they're with the smugglers waiting to be smuggled across to, not to freedom, but to out of the country, essentially, is this notion that Lynch has and that he puts in his characters' mouths and his characters' actions, that this is all fated, that nothing could be done. So it's not so much that Eilish imagines herself to be making difficult decisions. It's that she doesn't imagine there to be a decision to be made at all. She imagines herself to have no agency in this situation, which is then a position that is endorsed explicitly by the author. In fact, on the one of the opening quotes, right? All that is all that can be, or something to that effect. And the problem with that is that the momentum of the narrative itself suggests that that's just not true.
Okay.
Right? That she is consistently, Eilish is making choices, even as she imagines herself to be powerless to the flow of events.
Okay.
And that, to me, I think that's the big problem with her character.
That's interesting. So I want to put a pin in that, because that's one of the kind of mythologies, you know, societal meaning structures that I want to come back to, which is the notion of, I don't know what the right term for it is, the comfortable liberal, or the educated person of some means within society who believes themselves to be an agent, and what level of agency do you actually have at the end of the day, which I think is a core question the book is asking. In terms of plot, or sorry, our first section on the surface, I think we didn't quite go through the plot, but we did it in enough detail that I think listeners and viewers might have a sense of what goes on without just giving a bunch of spoilers. Exactly. So I think we might be okay with that. In terms of kind of questions of technique and maybe intertextual allusions, which is also an on the surface thing. What do you want to say about that?
Well, one of the distinctive elements of the prose, for sure, is the kind of the flowing sense of it. We get no meaningful paragraph breaks. We get very long sentences that are sometimes absent punctuation. There's a lot of discussion between the characters, a lot of interchange between the characters, and direct quotes that are not offset with quotation marks. So this has been, I think, correctly identified by some reviewers as a kind of attempt to create a claustrophobic sense of what things are like for Eilish. This is all told from Eilish's perspective, right? So what it's like for her life to feel as jumbled up, right, as it does during this period. And so Lynch has created he has stylized the presentation of the prose in a way that emphasizes that claustrophobic, flowing, nature in which there aren't clear breaks or clear ways to organize experience. That, I think, technically is probably the most distinctive element.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. And so, when characters are speaking, there's people think words, their speech isn't put in quotation marks, and as you say, there's no paragraph break, so it just becomes a stream of consciousness. Is it stream of consciousness? Would you put it in those terms? It has elements of that.
It has elements of that, particularly when you consider that another distinctive element is that there's this constant interweaving of metaphor and allegory, and particularly with references to nature.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a kind of a slipping in and out of all of that. And I think the idea, again, is to present a kind of sensory experience that feels overwhelming to the character.
Yeah.
And that Lynch is trying to convey that sense of being overwhelmed to the reader as well.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's worth saying that although this is a distinctive technique in fiction, it is not original. And it's I think some of the reviewers have imagined this to be a radical and inventive technique, and it really is not. It's a technique that was, we were talking about earlier. The obvious example that comes to mind is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 1975 book, The Autumn of the Patriarch, which is actually even more jarring and disorienting in a stylistic sense, because he doesn't even end sentences. It's just all one long sentence. And for pages and pages, sometimes chapters on end. And there are others as well. And you had talked about, there are elements of Hemingway's fiction in which you get this kind of jumbled up presentation of the narrative. This is not to invalidate it as a method, but it is to maybe put the brakes on the idea that this is something radically inventive that's never been seen in fiction before.
I was going to say, I did not... When I read it, I thought this is a style and a recognizable style. I didn't think this is a revolution in literary
and
prose.
And as we were talking about, neither of us found it difficult to read or to follow.
No.
Right? We've seen this kind of thing before, which is something else that I've seen some reviewers say, is that they felt disoriented themselves in reading it and they couldn't understand what was going on. I thought it was perfectly comprehensible.
It was pretty grounded, I thought, actually, to be honest. The other distinctive part of his technique that I noticed and that reviewers have commented on, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, is that there's sort of a fairly constant use of use as verbs of words that are not verbs. So he says things like the traffic light reds, she forks a salad, she coins free a shopping cart.
Yeah, so I didn't know if that was...
At first I thought it was like
if it was
typos, and then I thought, is it an Irish thing?
See, this is what I was wondering. I didn't know if it was colloquial and if it's... And so I guess I still don't know. Apparently not, if reviewers are...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of it being a distinctively Irish way of speech. If it is, that's interesting and so on. But again, I thought it was interesting the first couple of times, then I thought it was a bit sort of affected.
Yeah, and I don't know what the point of that would be. If we can understand the stylistic choice of, of not using conventional marks of punctuation.
Right.
As pointing to, we're trying to create the environment, to mimic the environment of claustrophobia and overwhelmedness that Eilish is feeling, then I wouldn't know how to explain.
So it's sort of Hemingway-esque. It's a very economic way of writing because you're cutting down literally the number of words in a sentence, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, but for reviewers and people who have not liked the book, they've posited that on occasion Lynch doesn't quite trust the scenario he's created to carry the weight of the novel, and so he's had to do some quite showy things, showy metaphors, and odd ways of writing to retain interest. Yeah. Okay, good. So that should do it for On the Surface.
Yes.
And so we will take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Section 2, Mythologies. And we're back with Section 2 of our discussion of Paul Lynch's Prophet Song. This is the section on mythologies. In this section, we maybe veer away slightly from actually quite a lot from the author's intention and the kind of literal presence of words on a page in this case. And we talk about meaning structures that might be necessary or might be brought to the text by particular audiences and that are going to help them or direct them in how to decode its meaning. I think there's a couple of things we might talk about in terms of Prophet Song, Jeff. The one I really want to talk about is the notion of the comfortable liberal. And I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, and maybe I want to talk about the notion of the comfortable liberal because I'm a comfortable liberal.
Yeah.
But what I mean by this is the person who is like Eilish or Larry Stack. Larry is very proud of his sort of leadership position within a trade union, yep. And he's sort of very convinced that he can't be bossed around. Yes. I mean, he says at one point, I am the Deputy General Section of the Teachers Union of Ireland. I do not hop, skip, and jump at their every command, the there being the powers that be in the state and so forth.
Yeah.
Eilish is, what is she? She's like a scientist by trade.
Yeah.
But she's working in a sort of...
like a biotech
but it's like an
company.
But it's some kind of multinational or does multinational business or...
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. But she too has
a... She has a PhD. She's very learned.
So these are both like educated people who are not the kind of super elite,
right?
At all, or really, they're certainly an educational elite, but probably not a financial elite. But nonetheless, they live comfortable, what you would call in a UK context or an Irish context, middle class lives. In American context, you'd probably say what upper middle class, upper middle class lives. These are people, I would say, and this I do think is a key, certainly to how I read the book. These are people who believe themselves to be meaningful agents in control of their own lives. They believe in things like the sphere of autonomy that the state accords to the individual and the family unit to determine its own kind of destiny. And they believe in that largely because they learned political theory at some point in, if not university, and kind of high school, and that they've sort of absorbed. They believe in democracy, they believe in civil rights and sort of classical liberalism. And they believe in them not as perhaps people do in some societies that are not liberal democracies, as kind of causes to be fought for and things to be achieved, but they actually believe in them as facts of life.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And they also have what we might, I was going to say in another context, maybe in this context, they believe in privilege, or they have privilege. They have the privilege of, for example, if they're stopped by the police, they believe they're going to be treated in a reasonable way. And if they're not treated in a reasonable way, they believe that pointing out the treatment is unreasonable will get the police to stop, or going to a lawyer if you need to, or a court will get the behavior to stop, right? These are people who think they're in control of their lives. They believe themselves to be effective, and they're secure in their long-term future. And what I think is interesting about the novel is that it's a deconstruction or showing to be false of that complacent belief.
Yes, it's a showing to be false of the complacent belief. But what it really is part of what's going on here is a kind of yo-yoing back and forth between the presentation of the Stack family, and Eilish in particular, as fully autonomous and fully capable of complete control over the circumstances of her life and of her destiny. And then the exact opposite, as being completely under the thumb of fate and circumstance. And I would venture, I suppose, that both positions are deeply unrealistic. And the problem with Lynch's narrative is that he doesn't seem to understand that the notion that one is completely under the thumb of circumstance is just as unrealistic as the notion that one has full autonomy over the circumstances of their lives. But I agree.
Right? But it might be unrealistic, but that's the subjective beliefs of the family. Again, that's why it's so important that there's a relentless focus not on the actuality, but it's the subjective experience of Eilish and her subjective belief.
Yes and no. I mean, in fairness, I think to Eilish, I think that her husband Larry is presented as being way more confident in his ability to control the circumstances of life than Eilish is, right? I mean, from the beginning, Eilish is having these kinds of like dark omens, right? I mean, literally from the first line of the novel, right? The rapping on the window, right? So I think, in fairness to her, she seems to be a little less self-confident on these grounds than her husband is.
Okay.
which I think is probably what makes it especially difficult for her when she has the opportunity to basically prevent him from going to the protest at which he will be disappeared. Mm-hmm. And if she's finally convinced him, right, to maybe not go and to maybe pull back, and that maybe the circumstances here are not in his control. And then just as he's about to agree with her, she says, no, you should go anyway. Stand on principle.
Yeah.
And of course, then he's, the roiling catastrophe begins.
Right. And that's the dilemma of the story. And that's the political point I think Lynch is trying to make is, that if Larry doesn't go, he's kind of self-defeating. I mean, in the literal sense, he has defeated his own ideals.
Yes.
And any act of protest, potentially carries risk. Mm-hmm. But it's also the only way that a kind of liberal state can survive and can renew itself.
Yeah.
And the horror of the book is the attempt is made to make that judgment, to exercise the rights that are necessary for the state to continue to exist. But it's the inaccurate perception of what the consequences of that are going to be. It's right. That it's a circumstance where everyone is used to there being a certain set of boundaries and a certain set of normal political behaviors.
Yeah.
And those boundaries and behaviors have changed.
Yeah.
And Larry in particular at the start is caught not having perceived that change in time and being swallowed up by the state. And that I did find quite... So you didn't find that relatable? You didn't find an echo of that in, there were lots of... I mean, we should try and make this non-partisan, but there were lots of people who after the 2016 presidential election were sort of stunned at what had happened and then found it very difficult to accurately understand what had happened and where the boundaries were. And you remember the very first thing that was done by the administration was an attempt on a ban of immigration from predominantly Muslim countries. And no one could quite tell where that was going and what the proper means of opposing it was. And it turned out that the proper means of opposing it was a fairly normal liberal democratic means of opposing it, which was written so cack-handedly and obviously illegally, and the kind of the courts struck it down at least at first. Yeah. But there were also kind of mass protests. There was the Women's March, for example, in the aftermath of the presidential election. And I suppose the kind of the what if is, let's say there's the Women's March and the police don't just let it happen, but they actually start kind of laying into the people with truncheons. And then what do people do? Is there a second larger march in response to that? Yeah. And what if the state actually keeps ratcheting up? Yeah. And when you're in these moments, it's not actually entirely, you don't have full certainty as to what the next move would be. And the point of the novel, I think, is this what if the people on the other side are actually much more ruthless than you're perceiving them to be.
Sure.
Which is one of the ultimate liberal fears in public life, right? Which is why I think the comfortable liberal is one of the important meaning structures for decoding this. It's that the rules of the game are, we quote unquote, or the comfortable liberal thinks these are the rules of the game, but actually the other people are a lot harder and more ruthless, and they can win actually as soon as they choose to win. Yeah. Especially because I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm speaking in terms of these mythological structures. We do not perceive that the rules of the game have changed. Right. And I'm sure there's a point that in any state with a liberal framework that backslides into authoritarianism, those things must happen both on a macro and a micro level.
Sure. And it also points to, it's a very privileged position, as it turns out, to believe that you will be protected by, the ineffability of something like rights.
Right.
All of that is true. But part of the issue with this narrative is that we don't know for how long this regime has been in power. And we don't know what has already happened in order to get to this point.
I think it was a few months, wasn't it?
And other points, I think we're supposed to believe it's been a couple of years.
Okay.
and that power has been consolidating the entire time. I got the sense from the first part of the book that that the regime was not new, and that this kind of low-level increasing repression had been going on for some time. And so if that's the case, then Larry's kind of obtuseness about what's happening is especially pronounced and points especially to the privilege of this imagined privilege of the position that he and the family are in.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that it's not like Larry is the first of his peers who gets disappeared. Right. I mean, there are multiple other people to whom this has already happened. And it still doesn't really seem to penetrate, right?
But again, I think this is precisely the point, right? That it doesn't penetrate because the comfortable liberal is someone who believes in a set of things, but because of their privilege is rarely called upon to take risks in service of them. So that the challenge that is being posed by Lynch, I would suggest, is to the comfortable liberal, don't be so secure and self-satisfied in your own position, but also the challenge of even within your own society, there are people who are not comfortable and for whom these kind of damaging encounters with the state are to be expected. And when Larry pompously jumps up and down and says, I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the Trade Union, I do not hop, skip, and jump. Well, there are lots of people for whom an quote-unquote ordinary interaction with an instrument of state power is entirely kind of dangerous and so forth. And this is not at all an original point. Right. But, I distinctly remember being pulled over by the police a couple of years ago for something like driving over too far to the right or, over a side and it was a cycle lane or something. And being like, that was weird, but also being like, this is weird. Like, why have you pulled me over? And being not scared and being totally respectful, but also, willing to kind of argue my, I didn't actually realize that was something I was not supposed to do. And would it not be more dangerous for me to be too close to the oncoming traffic and blah, 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 but here I am, white, upper middle class, educated, person. For other groups in society, being pulled over by the police is A, more frequent, and B, inherently more threatening. And so maybe that's the other side of the of the coin. Yeah, I guess, if I explain that at all. Yeah, relatively clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that that's part of what's going on here. I guess it's not clear to me that the position of what you're calling the comfortable liberal is as widespread as Lynch seems to think.
Is it not the boiled frog? I mean, there's a boiled frog problem,
that's the
right?
Analogy.
The frog doesn't know, as the heat gets turned up, the frog is like, oh, this is comfortable. And then it's like, well, the heat will probably go down, and it doesn't quite know when to jump out of the boiling water.
Yes, I think that's the analogy, is the appropriate analogy. But
sorry, jumping out of the water, attempting to flee the borders of the state of Ireland.
Too hot. Yeah. I mean, I just don't know how pervasive that incomprehension actually is.
Okay. What about this quote? This is Eilish when she's talking to some functionary of the totalitarian state. You speak about this word rights as though you understand the word rights. Show me what rights were born with man. Show me what tablet they are written on, where nature has decreed it is so. You call yourself a scientist, and yet you believe in rights that do not exist. The rights you speak of cannot be verified. They are a fiction decreed by the state. It is up to the state to decide what it believes or does not believe according to its needs. Surely you understand this.
So, on one hand, it strikes me as a fairly straightforward resuscitation of fascist ideology. On the other hand, it's also quite inaccurate with regard to the way that something like rights functions in a community. It is not actually up to the state to decide whether rights exist. To the extent that these are intangible kinds of felt senses of protection or felt senses of identity, even as a rights-bearing person or a rights-bearing subject, the source of it is located in the culture of the place, not in the state. The state doesn't decree, right? the sense of identity. It can try, right? But I would suggest that Eilish is not dependent upon the state for her sense of being a rights-bearing person. She's rather dependent upon the community and the cultural beliefs in which she is enmeshed.
But is this not, Professor, an entirely comfortable liberal belief? Because
no, I don't think it is.
Because from the state standpoint, right? You can talk to me about the culture and the rights that you believe you have, and the theory that might lead you to believe this. I'm the dude with the gun.
But
right?
Here's how you know that the state doesn't have control in the way that it thinks it does. What happens when they engage in repression that is considered to be well past the boundaries of acceptability?
They prompt an armed rebellion.
They prompt civil war.
Right.
They don't repress. What they do instead is inspire resistance. And I think it's pretty clear that sense of resistance comes from the felt sense of widespread violation.
So sure, absolutely. But then the arbiter of the question of who's going to win that civil war, the people who believe rights are decreed by the state, or the people who believe that they're kind of trans-historical inherent rights, or they're decreed by the community. The question of which view prevails then is one that's going to be settled by force, and that's the ultimate belief of the ultimate distinguisher, is it not, of an ideology of totalitarianism or fascism from one of liberalism?
I mean,
is the question of who gets to determine what rights you're allowed, and the principle is who controls force.
It's maybe not quite so stark, right? I mean, one of the ways in which liberal authority works is that it still relies upon all of the force and the repression of the state. It just disavows it and imagines it as being consensual.
Well, but then you've just proved Lynch's point, surely, right? That actually, at the end of the day, all of this rests on force, and the state is an entity that, depending upon who controls it or what it feels, it's actually often described as a sort of disembodied but thinking thing in this novel. Depending upon who controls the state or what the state decides is in its interest, it may for a time choose to grant you rights that you recognize as liberal or believe and believe are permanent and sort of trans-historical and trans-contextual. But the state may also change its mind when it determines that its interests or the interests of its people, of whom it sees itself as the kind of guardian and embodiment, have changed.
Yes, I think that's right. But then we get ourselves into the problem that you just articulated, which is that we're imagining now the state as some kind of anthropomorphic being, which it is not. It is nothing more than the collection of people.
Sure.
People acting in particularly routinized ways.
Yeah.
And Lynch doesn't give us any reason to understand that, right?
I don't know. I don't mean to keep arguing with you, but hey, why not? Heated debate. I think that the process he's trying to narrate is the state changing the people and changing their conception of what their rights are, and part of it is, if there's particularly recalcitrant members of it, you just liquidate them or force them to flee. I mean, the state actually has some interest in allowing some people just to get out of its borders, so that the people who remain are maybe a bit more amenable. But also, it's a process of, they control the flow of information. They do. There's this quote about where Eilish is explaining what the most terrible thing is and one reason why she hasn't left. She hasn't left because Larry was disappeared and she thinks he's dead. She hasn't left precisely because she doesn't know that he's dead.
Yeah.
And she's given no, it's the silence.
Yeah.
And she says the silence doesn't end, you see. They leave open the possibility that what you want will be returned someday. And so you remain reduced, paralyzed, dull as an old knife. And the silence does not end because the silence is the source of their power. That is its secret meaning. And I don't think the silence is the source of their power. Also, power is the source of their power. Yeah. But it is one tactic. This kind of, disorientation and sort of blinding of the citizenry, and sort of holding. Larry is almost certainly dead, but the possibility he's not dead makes him also a hostage.
Yeah.
And if you leave, the hostage will not be returned. And the eldest son, if he leaves it earlier in the story, if he leaves Ireland and this is really only a temporary thing, when he comes back, or he can never come back.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to close the border. So if he leaves, you probably never see him again.
Yeah.
Even though it might be the thing that saves his life. And that's the process the state is engaged in to consolidate its conception of what your rights are.
I agree that's his intention.
Okay.
I will simply say it simultaneously imagines too much and not enough of the state. It's almost certainly the case, as we later will find out, that the reason why Eilish can't find out anything about Larry's fate is not just because the state is intentionally trying to create a period of silence or a moment of silence. It's because there's vast lack of understanding and likely incompetence on the part of the people who make up the state, right? They probably don't know what's happened to him, or they don't care, which is different than this image of the conspiratorial, one-dimensional evil state that is controlling everything, including the flows of information, and is exercising power in obviously restrictive and intentional ways.
Right.
And we just know that that's not how power works.
But it's another way in which the notion of the comfortable liberal and its relationship to the state is kind of severed. And one way in which people who interact with the state from a position of privilege exert that comfort or that security is by finding the state to be broadly predictable and competent, right? Like, why do you keep savings in a bank? It's because you don't think the bank's going to be like, I don't know, how much money do we have? It's like there's a record, it's enforceable in the courts, and there's predictability, and that's the whole core of things. And yes, I agree that the state is not omnicompetent, but actually its incompetence is another source of its power, because it removes from any citizen the ability to expect any predictable response to your actions.
Yeah. I agree that that Lynch intends to shock a particular kind of reader out of a sense of complacency.
Right.
I agree.
Okay. All right. Good. So it sounds like I won that hands down, which is the point. I want to, before we leave this question on mythologies, Jeff, I thought we might just talk for a few minutes about another societal meaning structure, that of parenthood or family. Do you want to? I mean, I have some thoughts on this. Do you want to lead us off on this?
Sure. I actually found Lynch's depictions of some of the family relations to be the best and most interesting and meaningful parts of the narrative. I think he's actually quite good in describing Eilish's sense of disorientation and kind of feeling of powerlessness as the older son, Mark, right, is starting to kind of come into his own sense of self, and her inability to kind of understand her sense that she's losing a connection here, the connection of a mother to a child, but is kind of powerless to know what to do or how to do anything about it, right? An inability to navigate in a productive way that, she understands that she's no longer able to keep him safe, but she doesn't know what to do, right? And the same thing happens to the younger son, Bailey, as well, right? She's feeling the same thing that happens. Conversely, with the daughter, and this is a surprise, I think, to Eilish, right? The daughter was seen as pretty independent.
Yeah.
And as it gets worse and worse, the situation does, the relationship between mother and daughter gets closer and closer.
Right.
And so I actually think that the story is most interesting and most effective when it's small like that, when it depicts the sense of unclarity about how relationships between parents and children change at different stages of each other's lives. And putting that within this kind of context of danger, I think was especially useful and interesting and evocative.
Yeah.
So like I said, to me, that is the best part of this novel, and that's the best and the most interesting part of it.
Yeah, and on that, there's just a couple of points that I want to make on, before we move on to the next section. Eilish's father is an interesting character in this regard. Like, I think it's fairly obvious what he's doing in the story, the function he's playing, but I still think it's relatively effective. He's an older man who is becoming more dependent on us, in some sense returning to a childhood state.
He's got some state of dementia.
And he has dementia, and I think that is useful because it allows him to have moments of confusion and moments of absolute clarity. And at one point he just says to her, like, leave. You've got to leave. Like, it's clear what's happening. And at other points he wanders off and he doesn't know where he is, which is, it's you could critique it for being a little on the nose, but it's the exact psychological state of Eilish as well. Moments of realization of horror and moments of deep confusion. That was interesting. And then I thought there were two parts that really struck me from a parenthood or a parenthood perspective. I mean, one is the obvious, most horrifying part, which I think was really hard to leave, was Eilish's discovery of the fate of not the baby but the young
Bailey
boy, and that I did find memorable for all the wrong reasons. I know that's Lynch's effect, but it's just a genuinely horrifying moment and sequence and fate, and I thought he effectively, God, who knows, and I hope no one ever knows, but it did ring authentic to.
Yes, I agree. That was the most disturbing scene, I thought.
And it's really a
disturbing book.
I thought it was really a climax or a,
But again, like here, this feels to me, I don't understand why this is Bailey's fate.
Yeah.
The reader doesn't understand this. One could understand if it were the older son, Mark.
Well, but I think they were trying to both find Mark through Bailey. They assumed Bailey might know something, but they were also just trying to punish Mark through Bailey. And they're sadists, or that regime certainly attracts, and particularly in its power ministries, its power apparatus, is going to be attractive to sadists because they can do the things that they really wanted to do, but are sort of restrained by polite society. So one other thing we're running out of time in this section. There is one quote I wanted to read to you that I thought was a particularly beautiful piece of writing, and it's after I think it might be Bailey, but I don't quite remember the context. But one of the children has a dream that the father returns to them, and Eilish explains this dream or seeks to talk to the child about this dream. Your father is with you all the time, she says, even while he's gone. That is the meaning of the dream. Your father came home to remind you that he's always here with you, because your father is always alive in your heart. He is here with you now, with his arm around you, and he will always be here because the love we are given when we are loved as a child is stored forever inside us. And your father has loved you so very much. His love for you cannot be taken away nor erased. Yeah. And I just thought that was the sort of really beautiful piece of writing and really, really essential to the emotional experience of the novel.
Yeah, and again...
And true.
He succeeds most obviously, Lynch does. Yeah. When he's small, like that. When the narrative is small and it's tightly focused, and he's exploring things that are not bigger than the Stack family. Right. And I think, one of the things that has emerged as we've been talking about the novel is that as soon as he seeks to step outside of the specific daily experience of the Stack family is where he loses his footing pretty severely.
Okay. And we are back with section 3 of our discussion of Paul Lynch's Prophet Song. This is the section that we call critique.
Yes.
And I think you wanted to start with the critics.
Yeah. So this book has been overwhelmingly positively received by critics. As you had mentioned, I think at the outset, it just recently, I think maybe a month ago or 6 weeks ago, won the Booker Prize, which is this very prestigious fiction prize in England. And just a kind of superficial canvas of the reviews of this book would lead you to believe that it has really hit a spot in the critical acclaim. And so I think we should talk a little bit about why. It seems like this book has been so well received by critics. And then I think we should talk about whether that is something, that kind of critical acclaim translates into popular acclaim, and maybe ask ourselves what it means to have success at this prestige level versus success at a broader, more popular level.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I suspect it's critically well received, even if you're agnostic on quality or technical accomplishments. I suspect it's critically well received because it fits with the self-regard of liberal, upper middle class, highly educated people, i.e., precisely the people who might go into the profession of being literary critic.
Yep.
In the
people who have dinner and run in the same social circles as Larry and Eilish Stack.
Yeah, exactly. Which does make you wonder: is there? And I can't quite put my finger on it, but is there some kind of meta point or grand irony in the book functioning as an intended wake-up call to comfortable liberals, which is then received rapturously by comfortable liberals because it completely reinforces their existing self-perception, which is which I would say, maybe this is too harsh. I mean, you can pull me up if it is, but
I don't. I mean, but the plan of action here is to post on Twitter one's self-righteous outrage.
Yes,
but to do nothing else.
Right. So the way it's received. I mean, let me just read you rather than just dancing around it. So there's Melissa Harrison, the critic in The Guardian, and the book is The Irish Offspring of The Handmaid's Tale in 1984. No stage in the city's awful descent is unlikely, exaggerated, or difficult to believe. After all, we've seen it all unfold from the comfort of our sofas in former Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine. I think there's several other places she would meant Syria as well would be another. And there's that kind of liberal upper middle class apparent self-flagellation, the comfort of our sofas.
That's exactly it.
Right. But actually it's dressed up as self-flagellation. What she really means is you. Why aren't you doing more to stop this thing in the world? You're very comfortable. And as you say, the plan of action is to post on Twitter a scalding repudiation of everyone else who hasn't been sufficiently activist or morally pure or engaged in this evil in the world. And for people who find that unconvincing, why haven't you done anything when I'm sat here wagging your finger? You might say to me, well, you're sat here too. You're just wagging your finger at me.
Yeah. And that, I think, points to the fatalism of the book itself. To the extent that there's a message here, some sort of positive message that Lynch is offering, it's this kind of like, shock us out of our complacency.
Yeah.
But I don't know who's complacent, right? The thing I really struggled with as I was reading the book is who's the audience for this book?
Yeah.
Who needs to be shocked out of their complacency? And I'm wondering now as we talk if it's like critical, as you call them, the comfortable liberals, right? The people who sit on the couch and actually are privileged enough to imagine that their lives are unimpacted by not just political events, but by sort of social formations and, community changes in the community, right? And trends in the community, to imagine that their privilege insulates them from all external influences. But that's a very small population, I think.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what the other plan of action here is. I mean, it's not that a book has to have a plan of action necessarily, but this is not George Orwell, in 1984, portending to a pretty complacent global audience, right? A pretty self-satisfied, complacent global audience in the sort of World War II and post-World War II era, right? This is a work of fiction that is received into a world that is kind of on fire.
Yeah.
So I don't know who needs to be shocked out of their complacency.
So if you say there is within the genre of kind of political totalitarian novels or depictions of dystopianism, Orwell's 1984 is successful and Paul Lynch's Prophet Song is unsuccessful. That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah.
What is the difference? It's just that Orwell came first, or pointed out things people had not already seen, whereas Lynch is saying
important.
things.
Yeah. Timing is important.
Okay.
Like, this feels like a book that 20 years ago might have been brave.
Mm-hmm. Now
it feels trendy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So does it succeed then as a document? It's not saying new things, but it's a particularly skillful encapsulation of those things.
Maybe. Like I said, I believe, as I said in the previous section, to the extent that the novel works, it works on a small scale.
Yeah.
When it goes small and when it fixates on the parent-child relations.
Yeah. And Eilish's response to the novel's critique that you are one of the people who needed to be shocked out of your complacency and was not shocked out of your complacency in time, and so you're kind of paying the price in losses to your family. Eilish's response is, she says at one point, she's recalling something her sister said, and her sister keeps saying leave. Her sister's in Canada and sends her money and the means to leave. The self-satisfied voice on the phone: history is a silent record of people who did not know when to leave, which is what her sister had said to her. History is a silent record of people who could not leave. It is a record of those who did not have a choice. You cannot leave when you have nowhere to go and have not the means to go there. You cannot leave when your children cannot get a passport, cannot go when your feet are rooted in the earth, and to leave means tearing off your feet. And so that's the response here. But again, that undercuts the idea that this is shocking people out of complacency, because it gets to something you were saying just off camera a minute ago, that the people don't actually have a choice, that there is no benefit to being shocked out of a complacency because there's no viable path of action when these circumstances actually do arise.
Right. And it's also, that line is also undercut by the narrative in the novel itself in multiple ways. First of all, they do have the means to leave, right? They do have a place to go. They are advised over and over again to take it. But even more so, the only thing and there are two things that seem to be rooting, three things, I guess, that seem to be rooting Eilish to Dublin. The first is the unknown fate of Larry, which is pretty known, and people are telling her, right? But she can't accept it.
Yeah.
The lack of passports for the baby and the older son. Well, it turns out that she's not all that concerned about a lack of passport for her older son, because she concocts what can only be described as a harebrained scheme to have some neighbor who she barely knows have her brother smuggle Mark over the border in a rolled up carpet. So she's perfectly willing to make that choice, she thinks, for her son, but not for herself. And the third thing that roots her is her father's presence. But as you noted earlier, her father has made it quite clear that she should go and not worry about him. Because in another moment of lucidity, he says, they don't care about me. I'm old and I'm not doing anything.
Right.
And nothing matters anyway.
Right.
So the Lynch seems to me to be pretty inconsistent. On one hand, it's all fatalistic. And so you're right. What's the point in shocking somebody out of their complacency if nothing can change anyway, and if nothing can be done anyway? On the other hand, the narrative itself seems to suggest a series of choices that Eilish is making. She's not fated to this outcome, and that it's not just that she doesn't know when to leave. She doesn't understand when she needs to make a hard decision on behalf of some of her family rather than, for example, on her husband's fate. She imagines that she can control the outcome for everyone in the family. And even when it becomes clear that she cannot, she then just chalks her inaction up to fate. Or at least Lynch would have us believe that that's what she's doing. So again, I'm not sure if we can agree that the audience for whom this shocking out of complacency is intended is the, people who are writing critical reviews, rapturous critical reviews. what are they then to do if it's all faded anyway?
Yeah, so you might, I think you might...
You can write on Twitter.
Yes.
You can fire off, hectoring and self-righteous tweets.
Well, there do seem to be rather a lot of people who believe that's a good way to spend their time. Anyway, you might, some might suggest that I wouldn't of course associate myself with that position necessarily. You might agree with Cal Reveley-Calder, the critic in the Daily Telegraph, who was a descending voice actually in the universal almost universal praise. Yeah. The problem is how Lynch imagines political fiction to work. There isn't much to be gained from slamming morals upon the table. Most people who care about an issue as big as the refugee crisis already know what they think.
Yeah.
That could be me were I not in the West is the most basic thought any person can have.
Yeah.
So maybe he's kind of nailed it.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else we want to say in this section on critique?
Well, I think what do we think that the function of prestige entertainment like this is?
Yeah.
Right. It's not the only prestige texts that we've looked at. I think The Last of Us, for example, is intended as a kind of prestige show.
Right.
But is that kind of popular culture text, does it have a different intention or a different goal, a different set of functions than a piece of popular culture that is more explicitly pitched towards a broad audience?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So the function of literary fiction has to be at some level to be pleasurable art, or elevating art. So there has to be a certain sort of quality, for want of a better word, a sort of facility with technique and story construction and so forth. It's clearly not intended to be it's not a romance novel or a young adult. Not denigrating those, but it's not intended to be one of those more kind of popular arts. There's also the classic function of the work of high pop, or that maybe even regard itself as elevated, quote unquote, above popular culture, of being the work of the seer who sees things a little more acutely or a little more clearly, or can express them in a more beautiful or succinct, or whatever the artistic kind of measure of merit is, way. And so they kind of command more attention because they are allowing you to see things that other quote unquote lesser talents would not allow you to see. So they would be the traditional kind of set of benchmarks by which you judge this work. It's very interesting you mentioned The Last of Us, which I agree occupies a similar place of high pop. And what we thought of The Last of Us was, this is a highly competent recitation of a set of, or regurgitation of a set of genre tropes and techniques, and it's done very well, and it's very watchable for those reasons, but it's also familiar, and it doesn't so much help us to see things more clearly or see things anew, but it reminds us of other works that helped us see things more clearly or sees them anew. And I actually wonder if we don't end up in broadly the same place, and I'm not sure I think we were not as high on The Last of Us as the general critics, but we also had the same sort of sense that we perhaps have with this book, which is if The Last of Us is the first of that genre that you'd seen, you'd be like, my God, this is the greatest thing ever.
Right.
And if Prophet Song is the first dystopian novel you'd read, you'd think, my goodness, what a revolutionary thing. But when you see it perhaps in a stream of such works, you can sort of admire its construction, or the way it's put together elements of other more original works, more than you can say, I sort of wholeheartedly endorse this as a revolutionary piece of art.
Right. Yeah, I think that's all broadly correct. And I also wonder sometimes if maybe we draw the distinction between the prestige and the popular too sharply. And what I mean by that is if we think about, isn't it true that in the history of contemporary popular culture, that by and large, the most popular creators are also the most critically lauded? Perhaps not in the moment, but over time, right? In the American literature context, for example, think of someone like Edgar Allan Poe or Mark Twain, or later authors like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby in particular, right, is it was not at the time that it was released especially popular, and it didn't do especially well in the marketplace, but it did in the 1950s and 1960s when they began to distribute it for free amongst GIs overseas. And so, or think about the works of Herman Melville, right? Like Moby Dick was very popular at the time, and it stands as, one of the foundational works of American literature, of American popular culture. So sometimes I wonder if the distinction is too tightly drawn, that actually one of the things that should make a work of art revolutionary, that should help us to see in ways that we couldn't otherwise see, is precisely that it has found a way to express itself that is articulating with a broad audience and not a tiny critical audience. I don't know how.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, I see where you're
or
going.
Think
with
about
that.
music. We could do the same thing in music, right?
Yeah.
Aren't
the Beatles,
the Beatles, the Stones, even for a period, a band close to our hearts, Radiohead, right, for a time, phenomenally popular, right, for a time, and also that's their most critically lauded work.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So sometimes I wonder if this, we imagine this hierarchy to exist in our popular culture products that leads us astray in understanding the actual work that those products are.
Well, it's also not something you can tell in the moment, right? It almost by definition relies upon understanding the long-term effect and the long-term cultural influence of a piece of work, which can't be told in the moment.
Right.
And there's lots of things I'm sure that our works that make something of a stir, or maybe even go on slightly unnoticed, but will later be rediscovered or regarded as
and vice versa. Right? Works perhaps like Prophet Song that make a big critical stir and then kind of disappear, and everybody forgets about them.
Right. Yeah. Entirely plausible. Now, we started out. I mean, I didn't love this, but I thought it was very interesting with some quite effective passages. You started out hating it. Have we changed our minds? I don't think I like it less having listened to you. I mean, I take on board what you're saying, and I was never like super high in it, but I had a kind of medium lukewarm reaction to it. Have I softened your hatred?
Yeah, a little bit. You've softened it a little bit, but I remain perplexed by this novel, and I remain thinking that it makes a series of choices that I think are broadly ineffective, and that make what could have been an important and interesting story that could have done more than shock the complacency of, prestige critics.
Okay. Yeah. All right, good. Well, should we leave it there?
Yes.
Okay, so on that bombshell,